Hello, students. This is Professor Gore, and this is part two of the Vietnam War recorded lecture and so forth. So, in part one, kind of want to recap a little bit just to make sure you understand kind of how the United States has gotten up to this point in 1968. So, Vietnam fights for independence against the French colonial government right after World War II, and the Japanese are expelled from Southeast Asia. And the United States doesn't really favor French colonialism, but at the same time, Truman needs France in the Cold War against the powerful Soviet Union and Stalin. So he ends up not pushing France to try to get their independence and actually sends some weapons to France to fight against the Viet Minh who had fought for independence against France. Well, they end up getting independence. And the Geneva Accords or Geneva Convention decide they're going to divide Vietnam between North and South Vietnam along the 17th parallel. North Vietnam would be communist, South Vietnam would be democratic. Eisenhower, to support the South Vietnamese government, which was democratic under no Diem, he begins sending some supplies and just a few American military advisors. Well, there's two groups that the South Vietnamese forces are going to be fighting, and the South Vietnamese forces are called the ARVN, ARVN, and then are called the Viet Cong, which are South Vietnamese communist guerrillas, typically not in uniform, and then the North Vietnamese Army, the NVA. And so Kennedy comes into office and starts sending more supplies and more military advisors. In fact, his last year in office, about 16,000 were there. And then Diem gets assassinated along with his brother, and Kennedy and the CIA allowed that coup to take place. And then Kennedy's assassinated himself 2 weeks later. Johnson inherits it and then says he runs on the campaign. He's not going to send more American troops over there, and he does the same thing. So you have the Gulf of Tonkin incident that leads to the United States kind of having blank check powers for the president to do what he deems necessary to stop the spread of communism. So really, the escalation, which was accomplished in the early months of 1965, took two forms: deployment of American ground troops and then bombing the crud out of North Vietnam. And so there was about 500,000 troops in Vietnam or South Vietnam by 1968. And so what ends up happening is in 1968, things go bad with what is called the Tet Offensive. Okay. So supposedly the American commander there, General Westmoreland, said in late 1967, we can see the light at the end of the tunnel. Well, that light was a freight train coming their way. And so they were kept going for body counts, thought that the Viet Cong were going to be defeated and so forth. But Le Duan, who was the leader of the North Vietnamese government, pushed for a massive offensive when there was supposed to be a truce that was taking place because both sides had agreed to this New Year celebration truce. Well, Le Duan and the NVA lied about that. And not on January 1st, but later in January on the Vietnamese New Year, the North Vietnamese Army plus the Viet Cong attacked all across South Vietnam. About 80,000 attack 100 cities and bases, including in the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. In fact, some Viet Cong men got in all the way into the embassy building before they were finally killed. And so it was like, whoa, that is nuts that they got that far in. And so they temporarily take over Major City in the south, but eventually the U.S. and the ARVN beat back the offensive. So they're able, even though they initially lose, the U.S. and ARVN forces end up winning the Tet Offensive. Okay, now the Viet Cong are not entirely destroyed, but for the most part, they're destroyed. They're never going to be as effective as they were before the Tet Offensive in 1968. Primarily what the Americans and the ARVN forces are going to be fighting is the North Vietnamese Army from then on out. And so Le Duan's Tet Offensive ends up being a disaster for them, but in the long run, it's actually a victory because after the Tet Offensive, the American public overwhelmingly, or at least the majority of Americans, believe that we're losing the war. And so more and more Americans had increasingly not supported or no longer support the Vietnam War. Okay. And so here is where the Tet Offensive comes in. Through the Ho Chi Minh Trail, they attack at all these different places and so forth. And this is actually U.S. troops fighting getting besieged at the U.S. Embassy and barely hold on. These are United States Marines holding on. Now, the Tet Offensive witnessed or led to massacres on both sides. You had the NVA and Viet Cong would come in and just start massacring South Vietnamese civilians. You also had, during the height of the Tet Offensive, the village of My Lai was massacred by American troops. Now, this one actually comes out in the press in 1969 when Nixon is president. But what actually happened at My Lai was basically the day before, this one particular village that they had trouble, American forces had trouble telling who was friend and who was foe. They had, the day before, killed some of the troops in this platoon. Well, the platoon commander and his men basically kind of snapped. They're ordered to go back into the village to search for weapons the next day. Well, they proceed to start massacring villagers, men, women, and children. Some of the soldiers don't participate, so it's not like everybody in the platoon. In fact, they try to get civilians away and hide them. And really what saves even more people from getting killed is around 200 or plus that were killed was an American Army helicopter pilot lands in between him, between the American soldiers who were killing the villagers and the rest of the civilians. They were from South Vietnam, and he ordered his machine gunner on the helicopter, if they continue to shoot civilians, you shoot them down. That's how intense things got. In fact, he was later rewarded with a medal, and the lieutenant of this platoon, he ends up getting sent to prison, or I should say a military prison and so forth. And so the Tet Offensive is terrible and really changes the course of the American morale. Now, you got to understand who Walter Cronkite was. The CBS nightly news anchor was at one point voted in the United States as the most trusted American. He was a great journalist. He's since retired and so forth, and really, really well thought of by the American public. And when he says this, Americans believe that, yes, we are losing the war. And so you had two groups within the country, and the country was very divided on the Vietnam War. It's by far the most controversial conflict the United States ever involved in. You had the doves, who favored peace and us getting out of Vietnam. And then you had the hawks, those who favored war. And then just as much as you had protest marches against the Vietnam War, you did have marches in favor of the Vietnam War. That is oftentimes not seen in movies and so forth, but and I thought Ken Burns' documentary on the Vietnam War portrays that pretty well. But it showed that there were Americans who very much favored the Vietnam War and so forth. But after the Tet Offensive, the number of doves increased and the number of hawks in the country declined. And a lot of Americans kind of saw the war as unwinnable. And the big thing is LBJ decides to not run for re-election. And it was the first time a president has just decided to not run. James K. Polk in the 1840s only ran for one term, but he said he was only going to run for one term, and so forth. And there was a lot of protesters outside the White House every day chanting, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" And according to LBJ's wife, this crushed him. He really felt great remorse over this, and actually, after he left the White House, led to him becoming an alcoholic and ended up dying 2 years later. And this really crushed him personally. And so what you end up having is a guy named Eugene McCarthy, as well as Robert Kennedy, also sought the Democratic nomination, and it led to great turmoil at the Democratic National Convention. And so what ends up happening is, especially when Nixon comes in office, but even before that, Johnson tries to get the North Vietnamese forces to talk in Paris at a neutral site and try to come to a peace agreement with themselves, the South Vietnamese, and the North Vietnamese forces. Of course, I did not realize until I watched a documentary on Vietnam that Nixon had also leaked information at the peace negotiation to North Vietnam to try to help him win the election, which, by the way, is guilty of treason. Now, he claims he didn't know anything about it, but people in his administration did. But most likely Nixon was behind that, especially if you know what happened with Watergate. So anyway, we'll cover Watergate when we get to the 1970s. So if you look at the height of the war, there's a lot of South Vietnamese troops, the ARVN, and about 500,000 American troops that were there. And so Charlie Company, who committed the My Lai massacre, 200 to 500 unarmed villagers. Not exactly sure the total because it came out later. But here's Lieutenant William Calley, who gets sentenced to prison for the murder of those civilians. Okay. Now, then what happens after Dr. King was killed and violence erupted? Students protested at Columbia's university's plans to expand into neighboring ghetto by occupying several campus buildings. On June 5th, 1968, Robert Kennedy, who was going to be the popular Democratic nominee, probably would have won the nomination, and chances are, because he was in favor of getting out of the war quickly, probably would have won against Nixon. But who knows? Maybe he wouldn't have. But on June 5th, 1968, he is shot and killed by a pro-South Vietnamese guy by the name of Sirhan Sirhan. And really, it was a three-person race after his death between Eugene McCarthy, George McGovern, who later runs in the 1970s against Nixon, and Vice President Hubert Humphrey end up fighting for the Democratic nomination. Now, what ends up happening, we've never really seen this before in American history, where a party's convention erupts in violence. The Democratic Party gets blamed for Vietnam, and all these protesters descend on Chicago. The Chicago mayor has to request state troopers and other police personnel from surrounding states to come in. The National Guard gets called in, and I was watching this ESPN 30 for 30 a few years ago, and the New York Knicks, there was two players, one who served in the Guard, who was on the roof trying to provide peace and security, and then another player who was actually in the protesters. He was like talking about the irony of that actually happening. And so there was actually turmoil inside the convention center to the point where LBJ almost thought about flying to Chicago and try to get the nomination to try to end this nonsense. But what ends up happening is Hubert Humphrey gets the Democratic nomination, and all these there's different riots and so forth that are occurring outside. And Edmund S. Muskie of Maine was his running mate. And basically, the delegates approved a middle-of-the-road platform that endorsed continued fighting in Vietnam while urging a diplomatic solution to the conflict. All right. Now, what ends up happening is because of the civil rights legislation that LBJ had passed, the governor of Alabama, George C. Wallace, decided to run as an independent in favor of states' rights and segregation. He promised to clean the country up. In fact, he won more votes than any third-party candidate in U.S. history, I think up until Ross Perot in the 1990s. But what ends up happening is Richard Milhouse Nixon stages one of the great political comebacks in American history. And so one of the things that he did is he said that, look, there's a silent majority of Americans who support the Vietnam War. I'm calling on you to back me. You're the one not doing all these crazy radical protests, but you're being silenced by the minority radicals. And so let's join together and fix our country. And it was a message that worked. Okay. He also selected Spiro Agnew as his conservative governor of Maryland as his running mate. One of the things he did is he enacted this Southern strategy to try to win more Southern voters. He does, particularly after his first term, for his second term. And what he does is the civil rights legislation had federal judges began pushing for federal court orders to integrate school districts. And to integrate, even if you had areas that were primarily white, they would have you bus in minority kids, even if they were across town, into those schools just to integrate them. And so Nixon slowed down the busing, which won over some Southerners to his cause in the election of 1972. Nixon claimed he had a plan, though, in this 1968 election to win the war in Vietnam. Really, actually didn't have one, but many people believed him. And on election day, Nixon received 43.4% of the vote to Humphrey's 42.7%. It's a pretty close election. He only beat him by 500,000 votes or so. And Wallace finished with about 13.5% of the popular vote. The South, except for Texas, abandoned the Democratic Party, and actually never the South never really remained Democratic until maybe Clinton won some southern states and so forth. All right, we will get to Nixon's presidency in the next topic.